Kate fired first and her plasma bolts hit the creature's chest plates, but they just scattered and dissipated like water splashing on hot stone. Danny rolled to the left and emptied his entire magazine in a controlled burst that followed his training perfectly. But every shot accomplished absolutely nothing against the beast. Lisa tried to run, but one of the creature's long arms shot out with claws extended like knives. Jake tackled her aside and felt the wind from the strike pass just inches from his helmet. They hit the ground hard and rolled and came up running, as fast as their legs could carry them. Jake shouted for everyone to fall back, but the words were not really necessary because his team was already retreating and crashing through the undergrowth. Branches whipped against their environmental suits and roots tried to trip them with every desperate step. Behind them, the rendered moved with terrifying ease, and its heavy footfall shook the ground beneath their feet. It was not running at full speed, and Jake realized that with cold certainty flooding through him. The creature could have killed them already if it wanted to, but it was playing with them like a cat plays with mice. It wanted to understand these new prey and learn what they could do before it grew, bored and ended the hunt. They had only seconds before the beast decided it had seen enough, and Jake knew their time was running out fast. Danny gasped between breaths and checked his topographical overlay display. He spotted a cave system 200 meters to the northeast, and the entrance looked narrow. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left at this point. They changed direction and leaped over a fallen log that looked like it had been snapped in half by massive jaws. Kate fired behind them without even looking back, and her shots bought them precious seconds. The plasma bolts lit up the darkening jungle and created strange, dancing shadows between the ancient trees. The cave entrance appeared suddenly, and it was a dark gash cut into a hillside that was covered with twisted vines. The opening was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through one at a time, but that was exactly what they needed. Danny dove through first, and then Lisa scrambled after him, and then Kate pushed herself into the darkness. Jake turned as he reached the entrance and brought his rifle up one final time. The rendered emerged from the jungle like a nightmare that had stepped out of someone's worst dream and taken physical form. In the dim light that filtered through the thick canopy, Jake could see the creature clearly. For the first time since the attack began, those multiple eyes were each focusing independently and studying him with an intelligence that was somehow worse than mindless animal hunger would have been. The bone plates covering its body were scarred and pitted with marks that showed evidence of countless weapons that had tried and failed to stop this monster. Jake fired a sustained burst directly at the center of its massive body. The creature tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost curious as the energy weapons washed over its armor and did nothing at all. Then it smiled, and Jake did not know how else to describe what he saw. That horrible mouth opened wider and split into segments, and if there was ever a gesture that showed amusement, that was definitely it. He threw himself backward into the cave as the creature lunged forward with shocking speed. One massive claw crashed against the stone entrance and sent rock shards exploding inward like shrapnel. The opening was too small for the beast to follow, but that did not stop it from trying with savage determination. It slammed against the hillside again and again, and each impact sent powerful tremors through the cave that shook loose dust from the ceiling. Jake shouted for everyone to move deeper into the cave, and he helped Kate to her feet. They stumbled through the pitch darkness with only their helmet lights cutting narrow beams through the thick gloom. The cave twisted and turned and led them down into the planet's crust. Behind them, the sounds of the creature's assault continued and grew fainter, but never stopped completely. They found a wider chamber deep underground and finally stopped running. Everyone was gasping for air and their lungs burned. Lisa leaned against the rough cave wall, and her suit's medical readouts showed elevated heart rate and dangerous adrenaline levels. Danny kept his rifle trained on the dark passage they had come through, but his hands were shaking badly. Kate checked her ammunition and realized she was down to her last magazine. Lisa spoke between desperate breaths and said that the creature was truly intelligent. She had seen how it moved and how it watched them with clear understanding. It had been analyzing their tactics and learning their patterns. Jake replied while checking his own ammunition situation. He said every species that fought the rendered had reported the same thing. The beast learned from combat and adapted to threats. The plasma weapons did not work anymore because it had already faced them dozens of times before and evolved defenses. Kate asked what they were supposed to do now. Were they going to wait in this cave until their air supplies ran out? That entrance would not hold forever against something that strong and determined. Jake looked at his rifle and then at the knife strapped to his thigh. An idea was forming in his mind, and it was crazy and desperate, but that seemed to be humanity's specialty. He said that every species that fought this creature used advanced weapons. They brought energy shields and plasma rifles and biological agents and psionic attacks. Danny pointed out that those were effective weapons that any sensible military force would use. Jake corrected him and said they were effective weapons once, but not anymore. The creature had seen all of them and adapted to each one. Its entire evolutionary path had been shaped by encountering advanced technology over and over. Lisa's eyes went wide as she suddenly understood what Jake was thinking. He wanted to use primitive weapons and fight with something the creature had never encountered before. Jake confirmed her guess and added that the beast had evolved defenses against everything the galaxy could throw at it, something it had never needed to defend against because nobody used those weapons anymore. He pulled out his knife and the blade caught the light from their helmets. He asked when was the last time anyone in the galaxy used a blade in actual combat. Maybe 300 years ago or perhaps even 400 years. Kate said it was completely insane to even consider this plan. He was talking about fighting that monster at close range and melee distance where it could tear him apart. Jake said that every weapon they carried was completely useless against the rendered. But this knife was different because it was just steel made from iron and carbon. The creature's bone plates were organic material that had evolved to disperse energy weapons and resist chemical attacks. But physical trauma from a simple sharp blade might be something it had no natural defense against because it never needed one. Danny repeated the word might with heavy emphasis. He said that was a pretty big gamble to take with their lives. Jake asked if anyone had a better idea and waited. Silence filled the chamber, and was broken only by the distant sound of the rendered still working at the cave entrance. They could hear new sounds now that were different from before. The creature was digging and tearing away rock and earth to make the opening larger so it could reach them. Lisa observed that the beast was very patient and clearly understood that they were trapped. It knew they had nowhere to go. Jake made his decision quickly and told Danny to take the others deeper into the cave system. They needed to find another way out if one existed. He was going to stay here and give that creature something completely new to think about. Kate protested immediately and said he could not be serious. One man with a knife against that nightmare monster was suicide. Jake corrected her and said one human with a knife, and reminded her there was a real difference. Besides, he was not trying to kill the creature, but just survive long enough to learn something useful and prove there was a weakness. That was what Command really wanted from this mission. Anyway, which was data and information. Danny said he did not like this plan at all, but he was already moving, because he understood that arguing would waste time they did not have. Jake watched his team disappear into the deeper tunnels and then turned back toward the entrance. He could hear the creature more clearly now, and the digging had become more purposeful and effective. It would break through within the hour or maybe even less than that. He powered down his helmet lights and let his eyes slowly adjust to the complete darkness. Then he removed his helmet entirely and set it carefully aside. The cave air was cold and damp against his bare skin, and it carried strange mineral scents he could not identify. He stripped off the bulky upper section of his environmental suit and left only the thin underlayer that allowed complete freedom of movement. The knife felt solid and reassuring in his hand, and the weight was familiar. His grandfather had carried this same blade through a jungle on Earth many years ago, while fighting an enemy that used advanced tactics and brutal efficiency. That was several generations in the past during a war where humans fought each other before they ever reached for the stars. The old man had survived by being tougher and more stubborn than anyone else around him. Jake whispered to the darkness and spoke to his grandfather's memory. He said it was time to see if that stubborn refusal to die ran in the family bloodline. The Galactic Council had made their decision 3 cycles ago, and everyone knew it was final. Varith Prime was now a forbidden zone, and no ship was allowed to go near that cursed planet. The first expedition that went there never came back, and there was no trace of them anywhere. The second team managed to survive for 48 hours before their distress signal stopped working, and then there was only silence. The third expedition was different because they had the best warriors from the Kralik species, and their leader was a fierce commander named Thane, who had won 100 battles across the galaxy. This time the Council received footage, and what they saw in those final, terrible moments made even the bravest warriors think twice about their courage and their strength. The creature lived on that planet, and the Council called it the rendered, but that name did not really capture the true horror of what it was. The beast stood 12 feet tall on legs that bent in ways that seemed wrong and unnatural. Its body was covered with plates made of bone that would grow and fall off and then grow back again, in an endless cycle. The face was the worst part, with too many eyes that moved independently, and a mouth that could split open both horizontally and vertically, like some twisted flower made entirely of sharp teeth. But the most terrifying thing about this creature was not how it looked, but how smart it was. The rendered hunted with clear purpose, and it learned from every single fight. It studied the weapons used against it and found ways to counter them, and then it adapted to make sure those weapons would never work. Again, the Kraliks sent their finest warriors to Vareth, primed with plasma rifles that could burn through steel and energy shields, that could stop bullets and explosives. The creature tore through them like they were made of paper, and the warriors died screaming. The Xanthari species tried next, and they deployed their psionic enforcers, who were beings that could crush minds with just a thought and make enemies go insane with fear. The beast seemed completely immune to their mental attacks, and some said it almost looked amused while it killed them one by one. The Vryn were masters of biological warfare, and they had engineered diseases that could wipe out entire planets in days. They released a plague that was specifically designed to target the creature's unique biology and genetic structure. The rendered absorbed the pathogen into its body, and then it evolved and changed and became even stronger than before. No one survived the beast, and that became the simple truth that everyone in the galaxy accepted. Then the humans asked the Council for permission to send a team to Vareth Prime. The Council's response came fast, and every single member voted the same way. The answer was absolutely not under any circumstances. Humans were the newest species in the galactic community, and they had barely been traveling through space for 200 years. They were clever and resourceful with their habit of finding creative solutions to problems, and they had a reputation for being stubborn and never giving up. But this was not a problem that could be solved with human creativity or determination. This was death in physical form, and it walked on two legs, and it had killed the best warriors that a dozen species could offer. But humans had never been good at accepting no for an answer, and they had a long history of doing things they were told not to do. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the Earth Alliance ship called Defiant, and he received his orders through secret channels that nobody could trace. The mission did not exist on any official record, and if he failed, there would be no ceremony and no memorial, and no acknowledgement that he had even tried. He would just be another ship lost in the vast emptiness of space, and his name would be forgotten. Jake put together his team with great care and attention. He chose Lieutenant Lisa Hayes, who was a xenobiologist that had more experience working in dangerous field conditions than common sense would allow. Corporal Danny Wright was a scout who could move through hostile territory like a ghost, and enemies often never knew he was there until it was too late. Private Kate Sullivan was the youngest member of the team, but her reflexes were so fast that they seemed almost supernatural, and she could react to danger before anyone else even saw it coming. They landed on Vareth Prime during one of the planet's massive electromagnetic storms, which helped them avoid the monitoring satellites that the Council had placed in orbit. The jungle was thick and humid, and every plant seemed designed to hurt them. Sharp edges lined the leaves, and the air was full of insects that constantly tested their environmental suits looking for weak points. Every shadow felt alive and watching them, and Jake could not shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Lisa checked her equipment and tapped the scanner with frustration showing on her face. The readings were useless and jumping all over the place. She told Jake that the sensors could not work properly because there was too much interference from the local plant life. They were going in blind without any technological advantage. Danny knelt down next to torn earth and ran his gloved fingers over deep marks gouged into solid rock. Something very large had come through this area, and it had not been long ago. Kate asked if it was the rendered, and her hand moved instinctively to rest on the plasma pistol at her hip. Danny stood up and looked around carefully at the dense jungle surrounding them. He said it could be the creature, or it might be something that the beast had been chasing, but either way they needed to be careful. Jake checked his plasma rifle, which was standard military issue and had failed every single species that came to this planet before them. He did not have much hope that it would work any better for humans. Strapped to his thigh was something completely different, and it was a combat knife with a 10-inch blade made of folded steel. His grandfather had given him this knife, and the old man had carried it through an ancient war on Earth many decades ago. It was old-fashioned and primitive, and the kind of weapon that the rest of the galaxy would consider laughably obsolete and useless. Jake told his team to stay close together and move carefully. He reminded them that they were here to observe the creature and survive long enough to gather information. They were not here to fight something that had killed hundreds of trained warriors. Command wanted intelligence about the beast, and they could not provide that data if they were all dead. The team moved deeper into the jungle and followed the trail of destruction that the creature had left behind. Trees were shattered and torn apart, and the ground looked like it had been hit by artillery strikes. There were remains of things that had once been alive, but were now just pieces scattered across the jungle floor. The temperature started dropping even though the jungle air was thick with humidity, and then an unnatural silence fell over everything around them. That was when they heard it, and the sound was not a roar or a growl, but something much worse. It sounded almost like laughter, but low and rasping, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Lisa whispered that the creature knew they were here, and could probably smell them or sense their body heat. The jungle suddenly exploded with movement, and the rendered came from above. It dropped from the thick canopy with impossible speed for something so large and heavy. The rendered finally broke through the cave entrance just as Jake reached the wider section of the tunnel, where he had decided to make his stand. Rocks and loose earth cascaded inward and made a terrible grinding noise. Then that massive form was squeezing itself into the cave, and its bone plates scraped loudly against the rough stone walls. In the confined underground space, the creature looked even larger and more impossible than it had in the jungle. Jake pressed himself flat against the cave wall and controlled his breathing with effort. He forced his heart rate down, even though every survival instinct in his body screamed at him to run as fast as he could. The creature paused at the entrance, and those multiple eyes scanned the darkness ahead. It was searching for heat signatures and for the electronic emissions from their environmental suits, and for any of the technological markers it had learned to hunt over many battles. But Jake had removed most of his gear and left it behind. His body temperature was lower now in the cool, damp cave air. Without his helmet's active systems, he was nearly invisible to the advanced sensors the creature had evolved to detect. He was just another warm-blooded animal hiding in a dark hole and nothing more. The beast moved forward slowly and much more cautiously than before. It sensed that something was wrong but could not identify the threat. The prey had vanished too completely, and that did not match its previous experience. Its massive head swept from side to side, and that horrible mouth opened and closed as it tasted the stale air. Jake could smell the creature now, and the scent was like ozone mixed with decay. It smelled like something that had died and been brought back to life in a way that was fundamentally wrong. He waited with perfect patience until the creature moved past his position. Its attention was focused deeper into the tunnel where his team had fled. Then Jake moved with speed born of desperation. He did not try for a killing blow because he had no illusions about his ability to take down something this massive with a single knife strike. Instead, he aimed for the joints where the bone plates had to separate to allow the creature movement. He drove the blade deep into the back of what might have been the creature's knee joint. He felt the steel sink into flesh and then twisted hard and pulled it free. Dark blood came with it. The rendered's reaction was immediate and explosive with terrifying speed. It spun around fast, and one arm swept through the space where Jake had been standing just a moment before. But he was already moving and rolling beneath the strike. He came up on the creature's opposite side while it was still turning. The beast made a sound he had not heard before, and it was not the rasping laugh but something sharper and higher. It sounded almost surprised. The creature felt pain, and that was good news. That meant it could be hurt and injured. Jake filed that information away in his mind. The creature adapted very quickly to this new threat and dropped lower to the ground. This made itself harder to get around and reduced the exposed joint areas. It struck out with both massive arms at the same time and tried to catch Jake between them like a trap. He dove forward instead of jumping backward, and that unexpected move saved his life. He slid beneath the creature's body and dragged his knife along its underbelly as he went. The blade caught on something hard that was probably bone. It scraped across the surface and then found softer tissue underneath and cut deep into vulnerable flesh. Dark fluid sprayed out from the wound, and it hissed like acid where it hit the stone cave floor. The rendered roared, and the sound was so loud that it shook loose stones from the ceiling above them. It tried to collapse its entire weight downward to crush Jake beneath its bulk, but he was already clear of the danger zone and rolling away. He came to his feet breathing hard with his knife dripping with alien blood that steamed in the cool air. They faced each other in the narrow tunnel, and suddenly it was unclear which one was predator and which one was prey. The creature's many eyes focused on the primitive knife in Jake's hand. It studied this weapon that had done what advanced energy weapons could not do. The beast was learning in real time, and Jake could see it adapting its approach. It came at him differently now with much more caution than before. It led with its heavily armored sections and protected the vulnerable joint areas that Jake had targeted. Jake backed away slowly and let the creature come forward while he studied its movement patterns carefully. The initial cuts he had made were shallow and painful but not truly debilitating. He needed to do much better if he wanted to survive this fight. The tunnel branched ahead and offered two choices. One path led upward toward the surface and another went deeper into the planet. Jake took the upward route because he hoped for more space to maneuver. The creature followed behind him and squeezed through passages that seemed far too small for its bulk. Rock cracked and fell away as it forced its way forward with relentless determination. Like a living landslide that nothing could stop, the tunnel finally opened into another chamber, and this one had a much higher ceiling than before. This was better for what Jake needed to do. He turned to face the beast as it emerged from the narrow passage. This time he did not wait for it to attack first. He charged straight at the creature. The rendered reared back and seemed genuinely surprised by this sudden aggression. Its arms came down in a hammering blow that would have crushed Jake into paste. But he twisted aside at the very last second and used the creature's own momentum against it. As that massive arm came down with terrible force, Jake stepped in close. He got inside its reach where the long arms could not strike effectively. He drove his knife upward under what passed for the creature's chin and into the softer tissue of its throat. The blade sank in all the way to the hilt, and Jake felt it punch through flesh. Dark blood poured over his hand and burned like acid through his thin underlayer. The creature thrashed wildly and tried to shake him off its body, but he held on with desperate strength. One hand gripped a bone plate for leverage, and the other hand worked the knife deeper. He twisted the blade and cut through whatever vital structures were in the creature's throat. Then a massive hand closed around Jake's entire torso like a vice. It lifted him off his feet and hurled him across the chamber with incredible force. Jake hit the far wall hard enough to see bright stars explode across his vision. The knife was torn from his grip and remained embedded deep in the creature's throat. He slid down to the ground and gasped for air. He was pretty sure that at least 2 ribs were broken and maybe more. The rendered stumbled forward and clawed desperately at its own throat. It made wet choking sounds that echoed through the chamber. Dark blood poured from the terrible wound and mixed with something else. Some kind of biological coagulant was already trying to seal the injury and stop the bleeding. The creature was hurt very badly and might even be dying, but it was not dead yet, and Jake was now completely unarmed and helpless. He tried to stand up, but his legs would not cooperate properly. His body was not responding to his commands. The creature turned toward him and fixed all those terrible eyes on his position. They were full of rage and pain, and unless Jake was imagining it, there was also something that looked almost like respect. It took one heavy step forward and dragged its wounded body across the stone floor, then another step that was slower and less steady. It raised one arm for a final killing strike. Jake did the only thing he could think of in that desperate moment. He grabbed a rock from the cave floor near his hand. It was a jagged piece of stone about the size of his fist. He threw it as hard as his injured body could manage. The rock flew through the air and struck the protruding knife handle that still stuck out from the creature's throat. The impact drove the blade even deeper into vital tissue. The rendered's eyes went wide and all of them seemed to focus on nothing. It made a sound like air escaping from a punctured seal or a tire going flat. It took one more unsteady step forward and then its legs gave out. The massive body collapsed and shook the entire chamber as it hit the ground. Jake waited and did not dare to believe it was over. The creature twitched once and then twice. Then it went completely still and did not move again. Dark blood spread slowly across the stone floor in an expanding pool. He had actually done it and survived the beast that no one had ever survived before. He had killed it with nothing but a knife and a rock and pure human stubbornness that refused to accept defeat. Danny's voice suddenly echoed from the lower tunnel and called out for Captain Morrison with obvious worry. Jake managed to call back despite his pain and told them it was over. The creature was down and no longer a threat. His voice sounded rough even to his own ears. His team emerged cautiously into the chamber with their weapons ready for combat. Then they stopped short and stared at the sight before them. The rendered lay dead on the stone floor. The galaxy's most feared predator had been killed, and Jake sat battered and bloody against the cave wall with a piece of stone still gripped in his hand. Lisa whispered that he had actually done it and killed the unkillable monster. Her voice was full of disbelief. Jake corrected her and said that they had killed it together. Humanity had killed it by using the oldest weapon humans ever made. Kate approached the massive body very cautiously and began scanning it with her equipment. She said that the galactic community needed to see this proof. They needed to know it was possible to defeat this creature. Jake finally managed to stand up with great effort. He walked over to the body and retrieved his grandfather's knife from the creature's throat. He cleaned the blade carefully on his torn pant leg. Danny helped support him as they moved toward the exit. He said that Command was going to lose their minds completely when they heard about this fight. Jake told him to let them react however they wanted. Maybe it would teach the galaxy an important lesson that they had forgotten. Lisa asked what lesson he meant exactly. Jake looked back at the fallen beast one final time before they left. He said that humans did not survive because they were the strongest species or the smartest or the most technologically advanced. Humans survived because when everyone else gave up and accepted defeat, they picked up whatever was within reach and kept fighting, even if it was just a simple knife, especially if it was just a knife. The Galactic Council chamber fell completely silent as the footage played on the large screens. Delegates from 100 different worlds watched as Captain Jake Morrison fought the creature with nothing but a primitive blade. They watched him bleed and fall and get back up. They watched him drive that ancient weapon home into the beast's throat. Ambassador Chen of the Earth delegation stood calmly before the assembly. She let the silence stretch out because she had learned that humans understood dramatic timing. This moment demanded it. She said simply that the rendered was dead. It had been killed by one human with a knife that was older than humanity's entire spaceflight program. The Kralix delegation erupted first with angry shouts. Commander Vex had lost an entire battalion of his finest warriors to that creature. He slammed his massive fist down on his podium hard enough to crack it. He said it was impossible. Their best warriors had fallen before that abomination. Plasma weapons and energy shields and tactical nuclear devices had all been completely useless. Ambassador Chen replied that he was precisely correct. All those advanced weapons were useless against the rendered. The creature had evolved specifically to face those exact threats. She gestured toward the frozen image of Jake driving his blade into the beast. But it had never faced cold steel before. It never needed to defend against something so primitive and simple. The Zenthari High Priest leaned forward, and his crystalline features caught and reflected the chamber's light. He asked if she was saying that the creature's greatest strength was also its fatal weakness, that its adaptation to advanced threats left it vulnerable to ancient primitive ones. Chen answered that she was saying progress sometimes meant looking backward into the past. The creature was the ultimate predator when fighting modern galactic military forces with all their technology. But against a human with hand-to-hand combat training and a sharp piece of metal, it was just another animal that could bleed and die. The Vryn matriarch spoke next, and her voice carried the weight of many centuries. She said this changed everything they understood. Their entire approach to threat assessment and military doctrine needed to be reconsidered. If the rendered could be defeated with primitive weapons, then what else were they overcomplicating with unnecessary technology? Chen finished the thought for her and said that was exactly the right question. The footage continued to play on screens around the vast chamber. The fight in the cave was brutal and desperate and almost painful to watch, but it was also completely mesmerizing. The human moved with a grace that was born from pain and absolute determination. He turned the confined space into an advantage. He used the creature's own size and strength against it. The Kralix commander declared that he wanted to speak with this human directly. He needed to understand the tactics and the training that made this possible. Chen said that Jake was currently recovering from his injuries. He had 3 broken ribs and second-degree chemical burns and severe contusions across his body, and a concussion. He would be in medical care for another week at least. Vex said he would wait as long as necessary. His warriors would wait as well. They had much to learn from this human. Over the next several days, the story spread through the entire galaxy like wildfire, burning across dry grass. News networks replayed the footage endlessly and analyzed every single move and every strike. Military academies sent urgent requests for copies to use in their training programs. Scientists wanted to study the blade itself and understand the technique and examine the human physiology that made such combat possible. Jake became famous overnight, though he was not particularly happy about the attention. When he was finally released from the medical bay, he found his quarters aboard the Defiant, completely filled with requests. There were interview requests and speaking engagements and offers for training demonstrations from dozens of species. He told Lisa this was completely ridiculous as he scrolled through the endless messages. He was not a hero and did not want to be treated like one. He just did what needed to be done in that moment. Lisa countered that he had killed the unkillable creature with nothing but a knife. People across the galaxy were going to want to talk about that whether he liked it or not. Danny entered through the doorway with his usual grin. He said that Jake should embrace it. They had killed something that wiped out the best troops the galaxy had. That made humans look pretty superior. Jake said flatly that they had gotten lucky. The creature had never faced primitive weapons before, so it had no defense. Next time, if there was a next time, it or something like it would be ready. Adaptation worked both ways and could not be ignored. Kate entered behind Danny and held up a datapad. She said the captain needed to see this message. It was from Earth Command and marked urgent. Jake took the pad and read carefully. His expression grew more troubled with each line. Command wanted him to establish a formal training program. They wanted him to teach close-quarters combat with primitive weapons to galactic military forces. Kate said it was amazing news. Jake corrected her immediately and said it was dangerous. They were all missing the point completely. The knife worked only because it was unexpected, and because he was able to surprise the creature. But humanity could not build an entire military doctrine around the element of surprise. Eventually, any enemy would adapt and learn. Lisa asked what they should do then. Jake thought for a long moment. He looked at his knife where it rested on his desk. It had been cleaned and sharpened and was back in its worn leather sheath. He said they needed to teach the real lesson. Not just how to use old weapons, but how to think like humans. How to be adaptable and innovative and stubborn beyond all reason. How to use what you have instead of wishing for what you do not have. Danny observed that teaching a mindset was much harder than teaching knife-fighting techniques. Jake agreed completely but said it was far more important. The knife was just a tool. The real weapon was refusing to give up when every logical calculation said you should quit. That was what being human truly meant. A message suddenly chimed on his console. Probably another interview request, he thought. But when Jake opened it, he found something very different. It was from Commander Vex of the Kralix. The message said he had studied the footage of the battle many times. He saw now what he had missed before. Jake had been afraid during the entire fight. His biometric readings showed fear levels that would have paralyzed most warriors. Yet he fought anyway despite that terror. That was what Vex wanted to understand. The Kralix knew courage in the absence of fear. But courage despite fear was something completely new. It was a human trait, and he would learn it if Jake was willing to teach. Jake read the message twice and then looked at his team. He said that maybe the galaxy was not missing the point after all. Lisa asked if he would do it and create the training program. Jake confirmed that he would, but they had to do it the right way. They would teach the warriors that being human was not about being fearless or invincible. It was about being scared and hurt and completely outmatched but fighting anyway. It was about using whatever you had at hand, whether that was a plasma rifle or a sharp rock. It was about adapting and surviving and refusing to quit, even when quitting made perfect logical sense. Danny said with a smile that humanity's first export to the galaxy would be stubbornness. Kate added that it could be worse. They could be teaching them about bureaucracy and paperwork. They all laughed, and for a brief moment the weight of what had happened lifted from their shoulders. 6 months after the battle on Vareth Prime, the first galactic combat training center officially opened on Luna, which was Earth's moon. The choice of location was symbolic, and Ambassador Chen had insisted on it. She said the galaxy should come to humanity's doorstep to learn humanity's most important lessons. Jake stood in the main training hall and watched the first class assemble before him. 20 warriors from a dozen different species, and each one was a veteran of countless campaigns. Each one had been humbled by what they saw in the footage from that dark cave. There were Kralix and Zinthari and Vryn and others he was still learning to identify properly. Commander Vex approached, and his massive frame made even the spacious hall feel smaller. He said his warriors were ready to begin their training. Jake asked if they were truly ready, because he was not here to teach fancy knife techniques or special moves. He was here to teach them how to think differently about combat and survival. Vex asked if there was a real difference between those things. Jake told him to come along and see. He led the entire class to a smaller room that was bare except for various objects scattered across the floor. There was a metal pipe and a large rock and a length of cable. There was a broken piece of plasteel and a folding chair. Jake gestured to the collection and said this was their armory for the day. A Xanthari warrior's crystalline features flickered with obvious confusion. He said these were not weapons at all. These were just debris and garbage. Jake replied that everything was a weapon if you used it correctly. The galaxy had spent thousands of years developing specialized tools for very specific purposes: plasma rifles for ranged combat and energy blades for close quarters fighting, and shields for defense. They had all become completely dependent on these advanced tools. But what happened when those tools failed or were destroyed or became useless against a new threat? He picked up the metal pipe and held it up. He said this was a club. Humans had used clubs as weapons for 50,000 years. It was simple and effective and required no power source. It needed no maintenance and no specialized training to understand the basic principle. You hit things with it until they stopped moving. A Kralix warrior made a dismissive sound and said this was primitive thinking. Jake agreed completely and said yes, it was primitive. And the rendered was dead because of primitive thinking. He asked the warrior a question. When you face an enemy in battle, what do you think about first? Vex answered immediately and said victory. Jake said that was the wrong answer. You think about survival first. Victory comes second as a result of surviving. Humans learned that lesson the hard way by fighting each other for thousands of years before they ever reached space. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest or the smartest or the most technologically advanced, but they were still here because they learned to adapt. They learned to use whatever was at hand. They learned to keep fighting even when fighting seemed completely pointless. He tossed the pipe to a Vryn warrior who caught it awkwardly. Jake said the Vryn specialized in biological warfare. They had engineered plagues that could wipe out entire populations in just days. That was a terrifying capability. But what happened when you were in close quarters with an enemy that was immune to your pathogens? What happened when there was no time to engineer a new disease strain? The Vryn looked at the pipe uncertainly and did not answer. Jake said you hit them with a pipe. You hit them hard and repeatedly until they were no longer a threat. It was not elegant or sophisticated, but it worked. Over the next several weeks, Jake and his team put the Galactic warriors through training scenarios that seemed absurd at first. They practiced fighting with improvised weapons. They learned to survive without any technology. They studied how to read opponents through body language instead of relying on sensor data. The warriors grumbled constantly and complained that they were wasting time on obsolete techniques. Then Jake showed them the statistics that Earth Command had compiled. Since the battle on Vareth Prime, the Earth Alliance forces had engaged in 17 different combat situations. 13 of those encounters involved equipment failures or circumstances where advanced weapons were completely ineffective. In 12 of those 13 scenarios, human forces achieved their objectives by using improvised tactics and primitive weapons. The human casualty rate in those engagements was 43% lower than the galactic average. That information got their complete attention. A Xanthari warrior spoke very carefully and asked if Jake was saying that by embracing primitive methods his species had become more effective in modern combat. Jake corrected him and said humans had become more adaptable. They did not rely on their equipment being superior to the enemy. They assumed it would fail at the worst possible moment and they planned accordingly. When your plasma rifle ran out of power, you were completely unarmed. When a human's plasma rifle ran out of power, they still had their sidearm and their knife and their fists and whatever they could grab from the environment around them. The training evolved and became more complex. Jake brought in human instructors from various military disciplines. A Marine Corps combat expert taught them how to disable opponents who were twice their size. A survival specialist showed them how to make weapons from natural materials found in any environment. A tactical psychologist explained the human concept of fighting dirty, which meant doing whatever it took to survive regardless of honor or glory. That last lesson was particularly difficult for some species to accept and understand. A Kralix warrior protested loudly during a demonstration where the instructor threw dirt in an opponent's eyes before striking. He said this was pure cowardice and there was no honor in such tactics. Jake replied that there was also no honor in being dead. Honor was great and he respected it, but honor did not keep you breathing when you were facing something that wanted to kill you. Survival did. And humans learned a very long time ago that they would rather be alive and dishonored than dead, and remembered fondly by others. Commander Vex had been silent during this exchange, but now he spoke. He said the Kralix had fought with honor for 10,000 cycles. It was the very foundation of their entire culture. Jake asked quietly how many Kralliks died on Vareth Prime fighting with honor. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Vex finally answered and said 73. 73 of his finest warriors were dead, because the creature did not fight with honor. It used every advantage and every trick and every brutal tactic, and his warriors faced it while expecting a fair fight. Jake said there were no fair fights anywhere. That was the lesson. When your life was on the line, and when your squad's survival depended on you, then you used every tool and every trick and every underhanded tactic you could think of. The enemy would certainly do the same. The final exam came 3 months into the training program. Jake had arranged for a surprise exercise that the warriors knew absolutely nothing about. They were dropped individually into a simulation chamber. Each one faced a holographic opponent that adapted to their tactics exactly like the rendered had. They were allowed no weapons except what they could find or improvise from the environment. The objective was simple and clear: survive for 10 minutes. The results were very revealing about what they had learned. Some warriors immediately looked for conventional weapons, and finding none, they struggled badly. Others who had truly absorbed the lessons began to use the environment creatively. A Zenthari warrior used his natural abilities to magnetize floor panels and create a makeshift shield. A Vryn used overhead pipes to create a trap and led the opponent into a crushing mechanism. A Kralliks warrior, who was Commander Vex himself, picked up a simple wrench. He proceeded to beat the holographic enemy into submission with methodical and brutal efficiency. When they emerged from the simulation chambers, Jake was waiting with their final scores. He announced that everyone had passed. Some did better than others, but they all survived. They all adapted. They all found a way to win without relying on advanced technology. Vex looked at his own hands, and he was still remembering the weight of the wrench. He said this changed everything about how they fought and how they thought about combat. Ambassador Chen entered the hall because she had been observing the entire training program from the beginning. She said it changed more than just combat tactics. It changed how the galaxy saw itself.